"You're so mature for your age. You're such an old soul. I feel like I'm talking to a tiny adult." You probably heard those words more than once growing up, and at the time they felt good. They sounded like praise, like recognition, like proof that you were special. While other kids were loud, messy, and demanding, you were easy. You understood. You didn't ask for much. You knew when to stay quiet. Adults loved that about you. What no one ever said out loud was what that compliment quietly required. It wasn't just noticing your wisdom. It was rewarding you for not taking up space, for learning early that being calm made adults more comfortable, that being understanding kept the room steady, that being mature meant your needs could wait. So you wore that label like a badge, an old soul, a good kid, someone who didn't add weight to already heavy situations. But here's the part that often goes unseen. Children don't become emotionally mature in a vacuum. They become that way when immaturity doesn't feel safe, when reacting costs too much, when being low maintenance becomes the price of connection. That compliment wasn't just describing who you were, it was shaping who you learned to be. And long before you had words for it, you understood the rule. If I'm easy, I belong. In this video, we're going to look beneath that compliment, to understand why so many old souls grew up too fast, what it cost them, and how that early survival still shapes their lives today. Let's begin. When people talk about an old soul, they usually mean it as something rare and admirable. We imagine a child who seems wiser than their years, who prefers quiet conversations to noisy games, who feels deeper, thinks longer, and notices what others miss. In American culture especially, we romanticize this image. We associate it with creativity, insight, even a kind of spiritual depth. And for some people, that's partly true. Some children are born with a temperament that is naturally observant, introverted, and reflective. But psychology asks a different question. Not what this child is like, but why they had to be that way so early. When a 6-year-old understands adult moods, adult tension, or adult disappointment, something important has already shifted. That child didn't simply grow wise. They were introduced to the adult world before they were ready for it. While other children were focused on play, friendship, and imagination, the so-called old soul was tracking emotional undercurrents, noticing what wasn't being said, and adjusting themselves accordingly. This often creates a quiet sense of being out of sync. You might remember standing among other kids, feeling strangely separate. Not better, just different. As if life had already become serious while everyone else was still allowed to be carefree. What gets missed in the romantic story is this distinction. There is a difference between a child who is naturally thoughtful and a child who learned to be thoughtful in order to stay safe. And when that difference is ignored, survival gets mistaken for wisdom and adaptation gets mistaken for maturity. For most people, childhood doesn't end with a single dramatic event. There's no clear line, no announcement, no moment where someone says, "This is when you stopped being a child." Instead, it slips away quietly, in small, ordinary moments that don't look important at the time. Maybe it was the first time you noticed the tension in the room before anyone spoke, the way voices got sharper, the way silence felt heavy instead of peaceful. You learned to sit still, to stay out of the way, to become smaller without being asked. Not because anyone told you to, but because something inside you understood that this was safer. Maybe it was realizing that your emotions made things harder for the adults around you, that your sadness added weight, that your anger created more problems. So you learned to manage yourself early. You learned to pause before reacting, to think before speaking, to hold things in. While other kids were free to be loud, careless, and impulsive, you were already monitoring yourself. You were already asking an adult question inside a child's body. Is now a good time for me to exist? There's often a memory like this, small, almost forgettable on the surface, sitting quietly while adults argued in the next room, comforting a parent when they were overwhelmed, being praised for handling it so well. And in that praise, something subtle was reinforced. Your job wasn't to be protected, your job was to be steady. That's how childhood doesn't break. It just fades. And long before you understood the words for it, you learned the rule that shaped everything afterward. Stability mattered more than play, and being needed mattered more than being a child. In psychology, there's a term for what happens when a child grows up carrying responsibilities that were never meant to be theirs. It's called parentification. And while the word may sound clinical, the experience itself is deeply personal. Parentification occurs when the natural roles in a family quietly reverse. Instead of the parent providing emotional safety, guidance, and stability, the child begins to do that work instead. Not once or twice, but consistently. This isn't about helping with chores or being responsible. Those things can be healthy. Parentification begins when care becomes a condition for connection. There are two forms, and many people recognize themselves in both. The first is instrumental parentification. This is the visible kind. A parent is absent, overwhelmed, ill, or struggling, and the child steps in. You become the one who keeps things running. You cook, manage schedules, look after siblings, handle tasks that shouldn't belong to you yet. You learn competence quickly, because without it, things fall apart. The second form is emotional parentification, and it's harder to see. This happens when a parent leans on the child for emotional support. You become the listener, the mediator, the calm presence. You're told things you're too young to process. You're expected to understand, to soothe, to stay regulated when the adults cannot. Love becomes something you earn by being emotionally available. In both cases, a quiet belief takes root. My needs are secondary. Being mature isn't a personality trait. It's a role you learn to perform, and over time that role hardens into identity. You stop asking what you feel, because what matters more is what the situation needs. From the outside, it looks like strength. Inside, it feels like constant responsibility. And without ever choosing it, you learned a dangerous equation. Being useful keeps people close. Upbringing explains part of the story, but not all of it, because two children can grow up in the same household and respond in completely different ways. This is where biology enters the picture. Many people who are labelled old souls share a trait known as high sensitivity. Psychologist Elaine Aron described this as a nervous system that processes information more deeply and more thoroughly. Highly sensitive children don't just notice what's happening around them. They register it. Subtle shifts in tone, changes in mood, unspoken tension. These things land in their bodies before they ever reach conscious thought. This isn't weakness, it's a different wiring. You could think of it as a nervous system without much insulation. Stimuli come in fast and strong, and the brain works overtime to make sense of it all. In a calm, supportive environment, this sensitivity often becomes creativity, empathy, and insight. But in an emotionally unpredictable or demanding home, it becomes something else. When a sensitive child grows up around stress, conflict, or emotional volatility, the system adapts. You learn to stay alert. You learn to anticipate. You start scanning for changes the way other children scan for play. Not because you're anxious by nature, but because your body learned that unpredictability has consequences. This is where sensitivity and parentification intersect. The child who feels the most becomes the child who manages the most. You notice when something is off before anyone says a word, and you adjust yourself to prevent things from escalating. Over time, this deep processing starts to look like wisdom from the outside. But inside, it's a nervous system working constantly to stay ahead of danger. And what people call intuition is often just a body that learned to pay attention very early, because it had to. From the outside, you probably seemed unusually perceptive. You could read people quickly. You sensed shifts in mood before anyone else noticed. You knew when to speak, when to stay quiet, and how to say things in a way that wouldn't make the situation worse. Adults called this insight. Friends called it emotional intelligence. It looked like wisdom, but psychology offers a different explanation. What you were developing wasn't foresight, it was hypervigilance, a state where the nervous system stays constantly alert, scanning for potential threats, changes, or emotional disruptions. This isn't a conscious choice. It's what happens when safety feels conditional and unpredictable. Hypervigilance trains you to observe everything: facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, the energy in a room. You learn to notice the smallest shifts because, at one point, missing them had consequences. Someone might shut down, someone might explode, someone might withdraw love or approval, so your system learned to stay ahead of it. Over time, this vigilance becomes automatic. You don't experience it as anxiety, you experience it as awareness, as being good with people, as understanding situations deeply. But the cost is constant internal monitoring. You're rarely fully at rest, even when nothing appears wrong. This is why many old souls feel tired in ways they can't explain. The mind may feel calm, but the body never fully stands down. Wisdom, in this context, isn't just insight gained through reflection. It's alertness shaped by survival. You weren't born knowing so much about people. You learned it because paying attention once kept you safe. There is a kind of shame that rarely gets talked about, because it doesn't look like shame on the surface. It looks like strength, independence, emotional control, but underneath it lives a quiet belief that many old souls carry without realizing it. The belief is simple and heavy: needing is embarrassing. When you grow up being valued for your maturity, you learn early that your worth is tied to how little you require. You become the low-maintenance one, the child who doesn't ask for much, the person who handles things well. Over time, this turns into a deep discomfort with wanting anything at all. You might notice it in small ways: feeling awkward when someone offers help, minimizing your own struggles, telling yourself it's not that bad, even when it is. There's an unspoken rule inside you that says you should be able to manage on your own, that leaning on someone else is a failure of character. This shame doesn't come from arrogance, it comes from conditioning. At some point, expressing need made things worse. It overwhelmed someone, it created tension, it cost you emotional safety. So your system adapted. You learned to contain yourself, not because you didn't have needs, but because having them felt risky. In cultures that celebrate independence and self-sufficiency, this pattern gets reinforced. You're praised for being strong, resilient, and self-reliant. No one sees the part of you that feels guilty for wanting care, or the part that feels exposed when someone offers it freely. So you carry everything quietly. And the shame deepens, not because you're weak, but because you were taught that needing was something to outgrow, instead of something to be held. The patterns you learned as a child don't disappear when you grow up. They simply change form. And one of the places they show up most clearly is in adult relationships. Many old souls find themselves drawn to people who are emotionally complicated, unavailable, or in need of support. Not because chaos feels good, but because it feels familiar. You know how to function in those dynamics. You know how to listen, how to stabilize, how to stay calm while someone else unravels. Being needed gives you a sense of purpose even when it costs you closeness. At the same time, truly available relationships can feel strangely uncomfortable. When someone shows up consistently, doesn't require fixing, and offers care without conditions, it can trigger unease. There's nothing to manage, nothing to earn, and without realizing it, that can feel unsafe. If you're not needed, you might wonder where you belong. Hyper-independence also shapes how you connect. You may struggle to ask for help, even with a partner. You handle your own stress, your own emotions, your own problems. On the surface, you seem strong and capable, but underneath there's often a quiet loneliness. You're close to people, yet rarely fully met. conflict can be especially difficult. You might avoid it, over-explain, or take responsibility for things that aren't yours, just to restore peace. Not because you're afraid of disagreement, but because your nervous system associates emotional tension with loss. These patterns aren't flaws in your character. They're adaptations that once kept you safe. But in adult relationships, they can create distance where intimacy should be. You learned how to care deeply for others. What you may still be learning is how to let someone care for you without feeling like you've done something wrong. Healing for an old soul doesn't mean erasing your past or becoming someone completely different. It means changing the role you're still unconsciously playing. Psychology calls this process reparenting. At its core, it's about giving yourself what you didn't consistently receive when you were young: safety, permission, and care without conditions. Reparenting begins with a quiet but radical shift. You stop treating yourself like a problem to manage and start relating to yourself like someone worth protecting. This often feels uncomfortable at first because your system learned that rest, play, and emotional expression were luxuries you couldn't afford. When you slow down now, anxiety may rise. When you stop fixing, guilt may follow. That doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're doing something new. One part of reparenting is allowing yourself to exist without being useful, to do things that have no outcome, no productivity, no external value. This isn't indulgence, it's repair. Another part is stepping out of emotional roles you were never meant to keep. You can care about people without carrying their feelings. You can listen without absorbing. You can say, "I don't have the capacity right now," and remain connected. Reparenting also includes play, but not as performance. Play as safety, as exploration, as a signal to your nervous system that the environment has changed. The war you adapted to is over. This process doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small moments of choice. Each time you respond to yourself with patience instead of pressure, you weaken the old pattern. And slowly, the part of you that stayed alert for decades begins to rest. Not because it's forced to, but because it's finally allowed to. Being an old soul was never the problem. It was how much you had to carry and how early you had to carry it. The depth you developed, the empathy you hold, the way you understand people so intuitively, those are real strengths. They don't need to be erased, they don't need to be fixed. What needs to change is the belief that you must stay armoured to survive. You were shaped by responsibility long before you were given choice. But you have choice now. You can keep the wisdom without keeping the weight. You can stay thoughtful without staying on guard. You can be strong and still allow yourself to be supported. The child who learned to hold everything together is still inside you, but they no longer have to run the system. You can step in as the protector they never had. Not by hardening further, but by softening where it's safe, by letting yourself rest, by letting yourself need. If this video helped you recognize a part of yourself, you're not alone. This channel is a space for exploring the quieter patterns of the human mind, without judgment, without pressure. If you want more conversations like this, consider subscribing. And if any part of this resonated with your own story, share it in the comments. Your experience might help someone else feel seen. You survived what shaped you. Now you get to decide what stays. Thank you for watching.